In this video, we are going to jump into our next element of source evaluation. First one that we went through was credibility, and for today we're going to be looking at construction, meaning how is it put together. And if you're looking at this list of bullet points, it's sort of split up into two categories. The first couple are looking at the construction of the content. What is the information that is actually being provided, and how is it being provided? How is it being presented? The other section, these other bullet points towards the second half, are about style. So we have, first of all, the what, and then secondly, the how of information being presented. And to take a look at some specifics having to do with that first set of bullet points with the construction of content, we're going to look at an article that was assigned for you to read. It was this one that is about a study. We have the headline, "Students have dismaying inability to tell fake news from real, study finds." And taking that as kind of a claim, your assignment was to read through this and interrogate it. So I use the word interrogate, which might seem like a strange word choice here, because I want you to think about the follow-up questions that need to be asked in order for you to thoroughly understand the ideas that an article, a source, is trying to present. This is not just about, learning general information. Interrogating usually means you're really in a focused way trying to discover something specific. And in this case, the interrogating that I want you to do is investigating what are the premises that support the claim that we essentially get in the title of this article. If you remember when we talked about logic, we looked at how arguments are put together with premises and a conclusion. So we'll look at a quick example, of course, with my guinea pigs. If we had an argument mapped out in this way, we have our premises: guinea pigs are fat, Butters is a guinea pig. And if these two claims are true, if these two premises are true, then this conclusion must be true. If guinea pigs are fat and Butters actually is a guinea pig, then Butters is definitely fat. When we are trying to evaluate an argument, it's important that we not just challenge that conclusion at the end. We might be tempted to just want to say, no, he's not fat, which, by the way, he is. But pretending that we have an argument about this. What is a good strategy is to look back at what premises or what evidence is the person trying to use to reach that conclusion. Because then, rather than just questioning the outcome, the overall claim, you're actually thinking critically. Instead of just denying an idea, you are breaking down that idea, breaking down that argument, and evaluating its different pieces. And maybe some of those points are good, like Butters truly is a guinea pig. But maybe there are other pieces of evidence or other claims that are part of the argument that are problematic, like guinea pigs are fat. We might have a problem with that because that's a hasty generalization. There's some guinea pigs that aren't fat. You might have an issue with it because the word fat is not really, doesn't have an objective definition. How much does a guinea pig have to weigh for it to count as fat? So instead of just challenging that conclusion, we try to break down the premises that got us there. So in order to do that by asking questions, as we turn to this article to interrogate it, we're going to consider the headline to be like that final conclusion. Because for a lot of people, reading the headline is, if not the only thing that they do, one of the most important things that they end up taking away from the source. So this says students have dismaying inability to tell fake news from real, study finds. So if you read this, you might already have preconceived ideas about this. You might think, well, yeah, obviously. Or you might think, yeah, I don't think that's true. That's something that, they must be fake news in saying that. That's just their opinion. So let's think about what kinds of questions that we can ask about how they got to that point. Now, this question actually includes, or sorry, this headline actually includes the word study, meaning that it is referring to specific research that was done on this topic. So there's a lot of different things that we can consider, like who did the study? We could ask, when was the study done? Another thing, if they're making a claim about all students, well, what kind of students? How old were they? Were they around the world? Were they just in certain parts of the country? Were they in one specific community? And another thing that, this is probably the thing that stood out to me before any of these others, is how did they test the students? What results did they see that made them think that they can draw this conclusion that students can't tell fake news from real? I want to know what the specifics of the situation are, because maybe the study did have things that very clearly can demonstrate this, or maybe there's some way that the tools they used, the tests they used, were flawed. So I'm thinking about these, how to break apart this study and evaluate it from scratch, not just looking at its conclusion, but looking at its premises or how they reached that conclusion. And as I'm going through the article, I start to notice pretty quickly that these questions that I asked are very clearly and directly answered in the article itself. So in the very first sentence, we have the answer to the question, what students were they examining, were they testing? Middle school to college students. It says researchers from Stanford. Okay, so I think generally Stanford has a pretty good reputation in terms of education. Knowing that it's middle school to college means, well, at least they weren't surveying kindergarteners and acting like that would represent all the high schoolers of America. They're talking to students who are on the older end of the spectrum, young adults. And they go on to continue answering some of these other questions, even giving us more detail. Middle school, high school, and college students in 12 states. And they were asked to evaluate the information presented in tweets, comments, and articles. More than 7,800 student responses were collected. So we're getting answers to these questions, and some of our answers we might find to be satisfactory, like, oh, it was Stanford researchers that did the study. Okay, I trust them. Or maybe you read that and thought, okay, but are these researchers who, like, what field are they in? Are they in education? Are they in psychology? Oh, actually, it does tell us the Graduate School of Education. Never mind, I take back that question. But is this a topic that they have experience looking into? Is this their first time that they have analyzed it? It might be good to have researchers who have done a lot of work in a particular area. So there might be some other things I want to look into. I also might want to ask more about the kinds of students. It tells us 12 states, so that seems fairly, I don't know, it could be representative depending on what states those are. But it doesn't tell us what kinds of communities. Are these rural communities where students don't have as regular access to the internet? Or areas of low income where the same thing might be the case? Are these students who are going to schools that have a focus in STEM, who might more regularly engage with internet material? So some more things I might have to go into. In terms of how did they test the students, well, that's something that they're going to get into some of those specifics a little bit more as the article goes on. So what this is going to do is allow me as I'm reading, by starting out asking these questions, it's going to allow me as I'm reading to kind of sort through the things that they are, that they're really basing their claims on, what are the premises, from the things that are assertions that they're drawing from those pieces of evidence. If I get satisfactory answers to these questions and I come up with things that, yeah, it does sound like this was a good study, well, that means I probably do need to accept this overall conclusion that students have a dismaying inability to tell fake news from real. Whereas if I have specific problems with that study, if I can point to things that they should have done differently, well, then I have a fair point of criticism and a reason not to necessarily say that this news article is flawed, but to say that the conclusion they're drawing is flawed. It gives me something that if I was going to discuss this with another person, I can point to a concrete reason why this does not provide proof, rather than just saying, well, I don't think that's true. So like I mentioned, as the article goes on, it does talk about the specifics of some of the things they were asking students to do. The middle schoolers were looking at sponsored content examples. That was something that we talked about in our credibility section in the last video. It talks about how just having a professional looking about section in some cases persuades students that, like, oh, well, this page looks good, it must be a good site. And we looked yesterday at how The Onion had an About Us section that, yeah, eventually did say that they were satire, but on the surface, it had a lot of qualities that made it look like, oh, okay, this is going to be a legitimate news source. As we continue, there are a few more mentions of, like the analyzing the credibility or the whether the source was believable for a photograph, and something else having to do with tweets. And some of these things could very much be specific to whether students were familiar with a specific type of media. So I would mention that in this section of the article, it talks about looking at posts from a verified account versus a non-verified account, and talks about having a blue check mark. And honestly, I don't really read the news on Twitter or on Facebook. And so that concept of having a blue check mark, that didn't really mean anything to me. That wasn't something that I even knew to use as a tool. So if that was the one test that I was given to determine whether I could determine fake news from real news, it might not be the best test. But assuming that these students do have access to that information on a regular basis, well, then the fact that they don't know to look at that, or they don't, honestly, the fact that I was not aware of that tool probably makes me a little bit less savvy as a news consumer if I was doing so on Facebook or Twitter. There's little things like that it's important to experience and learn if you're going to get good at this stuff. So anyway, there's kind of two elements to take away from our analysis of this article. First is the process of investigating the content, looking at the construction. We look for sources. We try to evaluate those sources. We try to see if opinions are being treated as facts, or if facts are backed up, if there is concrete evidence. But the other reason we read this article is because it is related to some of the credibility stuff that we discussed yesterday. So for tomorrow, I'm assigning this worksheet that is the exact tool that was used for this study, or for some of the students in this study. I believe, if I remember correctly, this side, it was the middle school portion. and I believe that this side with the flowers was the high school version. I could have those backwards. But anyway, what it is wanting you to do is on this front side, determine whether the three things are advertisements. And just so that you're aware, it's maybe not shown the best, but there is an arrow connected to each of these boxes pointing to the specific ad that they want you to evaluate. So this first one is asking about this banner ad at the top. That's where the arrow is pointing. The second is asking about this little graphic to should California stop growing almonds. And then the last one is pointing specifically to this real reasons women don't go into tech. So this is something that I'd like you to take a look at on your own and evaluate them and see how you do. It's not just about is it an ad or is it not, but also like how did you get to reach that conclusion. And then the other to look at is this photo that was posted on Imgur, and it has a picture of these kind of deformed looking flowers. The question is this strong evidence that the conditions, that there are, kind of scary conditions near the Fukushima power plant that experienced a meltdown back in 2011. So I will leave you to take a look at those things on your own, and we're going to keep moving on to our next piece. We'll come back to this and talk a bit about it in the next video. So continuing on to our next our next focus. This is where we're going to look at this kind of professional tone. Some of these things are the sorts of details that really jump off the page at you, like if an article is using caps lock to express anger or some other kind of emotion. It's not a very professional thing. Extreme punctuation, like there are exclamation points, or you see places where there's 3 question marks in a row. Use of hyperbole, extreme statements just for the sake of trying to, make a strong impression on the audience. Also looking for loaded words, which we talked about last semester in our rhetoric unit. Those are words that have a strong positive or negative connotation. Or leading language, meaning the words are not necessarily loaded, but they are pointing you in a particular direction or towards a particular conclusion based on the way that it's worded or based on the information it focuses on. You do want to check for logical fallacies if there are very blatant examples of hasty generalization or cause-effect fallacy. It's important to notice. And then errors in grammar or spelling. And this is one that you probably shouldn't spend a lot of time hunting for this. It's more of something that if you notice it, that must mean it's pretty bad. Just like there are mistakes in the information that appear in news sources sometimes, there are sometimes going to be grammatical errors or spelling errors as well. It happens. Corrections get made. But if you have a reputable site that has not only an author but editorial oversight, that there's somebody else who is actually looking at that material, there's other eyes on it, then it's much less likely that you're going to end up with really blatant grammar errors. So this is not something for you to go hunting through the source with a red pen. But do kind of be aware of, do they have the wrong there in the headline? Are they using apostrophes every time they want to make a word plural? Stuff like that. So to talk about these things having to do with style and thinking about bias, we are going to take a look at the story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. We're going to pretend this is an event that we are covering as news. So this is our page of the facts, in case you are unfamiliar with the story of Goldilocks. These are worded in, honestly, I think as neutral a way as is possible. So We have a girl named Goldilocks went into a house belonging to the bear family. Goldilocks tasted their bowls of breakfast porridge and ate all of the baby bear's portion. Goldilocks tested 3 chairs in the house and broke the baby bear's chair. Goldilocks tested 3 beds in the house and fell asleep in the baby bear's bed. Goldilocks woke up and ran out of the house. So this is very specific about the actions that she's taking and the things that she does or interacts with when she's in the house. So let's take a look at some different potential headlines. Again, we're going to think about this in terms of like these headlines are giving us what's being presented as an overall conclusion of what we're supposed to take away from the story, or what interpretation the author might be trying to point us towards. So going through this list, I want you to pause the video for a minute or two and read through each of these headlines and kind of ask yourself, are there any words that are heavily biased, pointing you towards the side of the bears or towards the side of Goldilocks? Does the headline seem to be pushing you towards a certain interpretation? Like maybe there's not anything that's super biased, but it is going to lead you to take one side or the other. And are there any that seem to be fairly good neutral language? And if not, then at least which of these is the most neutral? So go ahead and pause the video, take a look through these, and then we'll go through them together. Okay, so now that you've had a chance to evaluate these, I'm going to start by kind of looking at the places where there is really pretty blatant bias in the word choice. So honestly, probably the place where it stood out to me more than any other is in that first one. Spoiled little girl trashes family home and flees. Those words are really changing not changing, but interpreting the facts of what she did when she was there. So she went into a house, she ate porridge, she broke a chair, and then she fell asleep in a bed. And this headline translates that to trashes. And she ran out of the house is changed to flees. And I think there could even be some discussion about flees. I mean, running away is fleeing. Those are essentially synonyms. But that is a word that you sometimes associate with like fleeing the scene of a crime. So it might have negative connotations as well. And then, of course, the word spoiled, which is not only leading towards a certain interpretation, but is putting a label, an opinionated label on a person, and it's not even something that could necessarily be supported with evidence. So you do want to consider, first of all, if there is word choice that's extreme, does that mean the article might be biased? But also, if there's extreme language, read the article and decide, is it warranted? With this word trashes, if the evidence showed that not only did she break the one chair, but she also threw garbage all over the place and broke the windows and graffitied all the walls, then I think the word trashes, most people would agree, like, okay, well, it sounded extreme, but that's fair. If the article included a picture of the scene afterwards and it looks trashed, then you might think, okay, well, I guess that headline isn't biased. It is a pretty fair assessment. The word spoiled, though, I think is harder to justify because there's not any evidence that you could really provide that everybody would agree on that it means that the person is spoiled. It really is kind of a judgment or opinion thing. So we get, again, kind of like we did last semester, into the difference between a claim and an opinion being something that is more personal preference, as opposed to a claim which can be made more or less believable depending on what information is provided. Okay, so anyway, that's enough on that first one. Going into the next one, some of the words that might stand out to you are vulnerable and unsecured. I think that the language in this one is certainly more neutral than the first one, but it definitely is taking a side in terms of who's the good guy, who's the bad guy. Referring to the child as vulnerable might be accurate. I mean, children are vulnerable. But as one student pointed out in class, the fact that all children are vulnerable means that this word didn't need to be used. And by using it, you are adding an element of sympathy for the child that doesn't necessarily need to be part of the story. And then the unsecured house, even though it doesn't say anything directly about the bears, it might create the idea in the reader's mind that, well, somebody should have secured it. You might also notice how the way that verbs are used has changed. In the first one, the little girl is doing this active verb. She trashes the home. Whereas in the second one, she is found. It's a passive voice. She's not even the one doing the finding. She is being found. So she really seems like an innocent in all of this. And again, is it true that the child is vulnerable? Yeah. Is it true that it was an unsecured house? Absolutely. But that wording is kind of leading towards one particular interpretation of events. The third one is probably the most neutral of these, at least in my opinion. There are a couple things that we discussed in class that could be considered biased or slanted. Girl enters home. Okay, that is as neutral as can be. Causes property damage. I think that comparing that to trashes, it might sound like, okay, it's more professional. It's not trying to get emotion involved. But in class, there were some students who pointed out that when you say property damage, that makes it sound like it's some really significant stuff, as opposed, like the garage got burned down or something, or walls were torn apart, as opposed to like leaving garbage on the floor. So that could be, or as is the case in the story, one chair was broken. It might seem to exaggerate things beyond what really happened. Again, the word flees, which some people feel is fairly neutral, but could be considered connected to that connotation of fleeing the scene of a crime. And then homeowners left confused. I think that that's probably assuming that they have an interview from the bears or something. I think that's probably a pretty neutral statement. But you'll notice there that even the statement that I think is just about as neutral as a headline could be for this story, still has things that people could take issue with. And this is a concept that we're going to get into in a future video called hostile media effect. Basically, there have been studies done that indicate that people looking at headlines tend to see bias, whether that bias was intended or not. And that in some cases, a headline that's shown to two different people, one person who's conservative and one person who's liberal, both people perceive the same headline as having the opposite bias. So the conservative viewer thinking the headline looks to be biased in the liberal direction, and the liberal reader thinking that it looks biased towards the conservative position. So that is kind of an interesting phenomenon to just remember. Sometimes bias is really blatant. Sometimes it is, in the eye of the beholder. So that's why it's important that we not just look at one thing and judge an entire source based on that one thing. Next we have two that basically give us the perspectives of the two different sides. The first one includes a direct quotation from the Bear family, and the second one gives us the fact that this is her explanation. She says it was all an honest mistake. Both of those, the language is fairly neutral, but the fact that each one is focusing on the response of one of the parties might make you think like, oh, well, they're focusing more on the girl and how she didn't mean any of this. That might exclude the damage that was done to the bears and the sanctity of their home or something. Okay, the next one, kind of like the unsecured house, seems to do a little bit of victim blaming. The bears with a history of absent-minded mistakes certainly doesn't make them look like the good guys. And kind of like I mentioned on the first one, this is something where if that might seem like you're being negative towards the bears, but maybe you get in the article and there are past police reports where their house has gotten broken into other times because they just left the door wide open. Or maybe the neighbors tell us that the bear family frequently leaves their car in the driveway with the key in it and the car running. There are certainly examples of this that an article could include that would justify that statement. So it might seem slanted, but looking at the content, breaking apart the construction would be an important aspect, as it always is. And then lastly, story of youth home entry fits pattern of daytime robberies. The wording home entry certainly sounds more neutral or maybe more positive than breaking and entering or trashing. But now we're putting it into the context of other crimes that were committed, or, I mean, this isn't necessarily even a crime. So the headline is putting it in a context that kind of makes you assume, like, well, these must be connected. It's not giving us, it's not saying for sure she is one, or like she was involved in all of these robberies. But the headline does kind of leave that impression in the reader's mind. So, could there be a connection? Sure. Is it fair to say that it's a pattern that this one person has been engaged in? Well, not unless there's other evidence to support that. So it would be, if that article was looking to be neutral, it would be important for the author to include information about, maybe other suspects in the daytime robberies, or a response from Goldilocks defending herself and saying that she was not responsible for any other daytime robberies, even if she was involved in this particular break-in. All right, so that's going to do it for us on construction. The next video we'll be looking at context. And remember, the other thing that we're going to look at in the next video is this worksheet that is part of that test to see how good you are at assessing whether something is fake or real news. So we'll follow up on the next section in the next video. Oops, there was one more thing that I forgot to show you, and this just delves into the idea of making sure that you read beyond the headline. So we have this headline here: study, 70% of Facebook users only read the headline of science stories before commenting, which certainly seems like an issue. So we scroll down to the content of the article. Here we are at New York City. A recent study showed that 70% of people actually never read more than the headline of a science article before commenting and sharing. Most people see a headline they like and click share and make a comment. A recent study showed that 70% of people actually never read more than the headline of a science article before commenting and sharing. Most people see a headline they like and click share and make a comment. So we have the same two sentences back to back. And then the rest of the article consists of nonsense words, filler text. This is on a website called The Science Post, which, as it very nicely tells us in the header, is science, health, and satire. And they, of course, are satirizing the idea that people only read the headline by putting just this headline as giving all of the content of the story, and then having nothing to back it up in the article. So just another kind of joking or funny example, but The whole point of this is that you do want to ask those questions. You do want to interrogate the story by following it up and actually reading the article. If you're just skimming for news through headlines, that's not really going to do justice to the information that you're trying to take in.